Hello, my name's Sam Lord. I'm going to talk to you today about HSE's inspection programme to assess the management of asbestos in school buildings. But before I do that, I'd just like to cover a few other areas.
I thought it might be useful just to explain who does what in HSE when it comes to asbestos. So I put this diagram together and we'll just work through it just quickly in a few minutes just now. So firstly, we've got HSE Science and Research Centre. These are the people that do the research into measurement, fibre exposure, asbestos exposure, electron microscopy work, all that sort of research which you may see and hear about. Also includes Lucy Darnton and the statistics team, so the epidemiological research, which you heard about the day before, previous day. HSE Science and Research Centre used to be the Health and Safety Laboratory based in Buxton. But yeah, that's the scientists based there. And these will be the people that will engage with other scientists, so through the PEROSH network and other similar networks. So that's how HSE captures its information that's going on in that area from other parts of the world. Then getting back down into the workplace, as it were, so the asbestos unit and construction division, these inspectors will be looking at work with asbestos, so whether that's licence work or refurbishment demolition work where asbestos could be a factor and therefore it needs to be considered as part of the risk assessment and the control measures. So that's those two areas. I'm going to be talking to you about the inspections in schools, the management of asbestos inspections in schools, and clearly that will be covered by the public administration, education and volunteers sector. So HSE has a series of sectors that are designed to very much get into and understand that sector. So we have agricultural sector, manufacturing sector, fairground sector. So their role really very much is to engage with the key stakeholders. So for example, the Department of Education, local authorities, the respective unions, asbestos in schools steering groups. So that's the sector. And then the people that will be delivering the inspections, that's the field operations inspectors and the field operations officers throughout GB, and they're supported by visiting officers. So they would be formally known as the factory inspectors. Then we've got the Health and Work Branch Engagement Policy Division and also Construction Policy Team. So these are, in respect to the Work and Pension Select Committee, these were the two branches which were very much engaging with the Parliamentary and Secretariat Office, producing the documentation that had to go into that inquiry, but then also the divisions that will look at any regulatory change in Europe, the post-implementation review of the asbestos regulations, for example. And finally, I would say that the Health and Work Branch have appointed an asbestos cluster lead, and her role is specifically to take forward the recommendations made by the Work and Pensions Select Committee report. And Helen actually will be listening into the conference as it runs. Finally, there's me. I'm a specialist inspector in occupational hygiene. Like some of my other colleagues, previously have worked in the asbestos industry as a consultant, analyst or surveyor. Our role really is very much to support the work of the field inspectors and the construction inspectors from a technical point of view, or deliver training, answer queries, but we'll also help support any enforcement, so prosecutions. We act as independent expert witnesses in court. My role is slightly different. I also, as well as doing that, I will also very much engage with external stakeholders, which is why I'm here today. But also I'll be the person that sits in the larger sort of working groups with all these other people. So I very much have an overview of what goes on. And really this is to illustrate that any sort of work, particularly to do with the Work and Pension Select Committee, we took people from various parts of the organisation with specific roles and experiences. So hopefully that was helpful. So let's have a look at the Work and Pension Select Committee inquiry into HSE's approach to asbestos management. This is a screenshot of the UK Parliament website where you can find all the documentation related to the inquiry. So all the oral transcripts, the evidence submissions, including that from HSE and FAM, of course, and also the final report and HSE's response to the recommendations. So that can all be found here. I would say that on behalf of HSE, we very much welcomed the work of the Work and Pension Select Committee and all those who contributed to the inquiry. And as you've already heard as part of this conference, whilst there's very much been focus on the recommendations that we are not taking forward, we will be taking forward 13 of the 16 recommendations. And some of this work is underway, and I'll cover that in my next slide. Some of the recommendations which will be particularly relevant to this audience, and particularly those who are surveyors and analysts, may require a change to legislation. So specifically the ones that relate to mandatory UCAS accreditation of all asbestos surveyors, and also a mandatory requirement for clients or their representatives to appoint the analyst who's involved in the 4-stage clearance as part of licence removal work. Now, clearly, those recommendations may require a change to legislation, and before we can commit to any change, we need to basically demonstrate that there's an evidence base to support that case for change. Identification of also potential options, whether legislation is needed, or could the change be achieved in another way? Personally, I think it's probably a mixture of both. A lot of these recommendations, including the ones that we aren't going to take forward, if you look underneath what the headline says, you'll see there very much could be unintended consequences or perhaps additional benefits, and all that needs to be looked at, and that's very much where HSE is at the minute. Whilst I talk about legislation, I think it's also important this time very much to consider that the control of asbestos regs is what we call retained EU legislation. So post-Brexit, nothing changed with respect to that regulation, but the government is currently bringing forward proposals on what is going to happen to that legislation. So at the minute, I've got no idea. More will be known about those plans in the coming months, hopefully. And just a final comment, really, is that, as I've already said, we're going to be undertaking work over the next 12 months to provide as much detail as possible on how HSE will deliver those recommendations. And I hope to be able to update FAM members and in other forums which I'm present on how that's going. So a little bit now about HSE's immediate work following the Work and Pension Select Committee inquiry. So our regulatory activity in the construction industry continues, so that's inspection of licence removal work. Refurbishment initiatives that we have will always look at the asbestos risk if the work is being undertaken in a building that could contain asbestos. That's always one of the priorities that's looked at by inspectors. So all that is ongoing. I'm going to be talking to you about the proactive inspections of management of asbestos in schools for the education sector, so I won't talk any more about that just now. And then I'll work with stakeholder groups, in particular those involved in the licensed asbestos removal industry. So particularly work with the two trade associations, ACAD and ARCA. And this work really is designed to, focus on where there is a risk of exposure happening, where people are actually removing asbestos, and just checking that the control measures which they should have in place are actually in place and being implemented. And I think it's very important really to make sure to check up on that, as well as all the other things where asbestos exposures could occur. And we've heard yesterday from Gary about the proposals to reduce the control limit for asbestos workers in Europe. Clearly, he made the point that whilst you can change the limit, the key still, what we can do now is still very much ensure that the fibres aren't released into the air where you're going to get that exposure, whether it's to measure or not. So control, as an occupational hygienist, that is at the heart of my profession. So very much emphasis should be still placed on that. And that's something which we can do now, very much so. And finally, the development of targeted messaging to those trades and duty holders involved in refurb and retrofit work, specifically linked to the government's net zero agenda. We heard about that from Stephen Timms yesterday, wanting to make sure that the opportunity wasn't missed whilst we've got workers going into buildings and areas where asbestos could be hidden or present as part of insulation, for example, fire protection. So that's very much ongoing at the minute to ensure that we're getting out to those trades and duty holders that are affected in that. HSE's inspection programme to assess the management of asbestos in school buildings. So I'm going to give you an overview of the inspection programme itself, and then I'm going to focus a little bit on what is different about that inspection programme compared to previous ones.
But first, why inspect duty to manage arrangements in schools? Clearly, we've heard at the Work and Pension Select Committee, there is an ongoing public concern, quite understandably. HSE's got evidence of its own of asbestos management failures from various previous interventions. And in line with our ongoing proactive intervention programmes, and specifically the commitment made by Sarah Alban when she appeared in front of the Select Committee to undertake some schools inspections in the year 22-23. And finally, all work which HSE does has to be in line with the strategy, and this does support HSE's wider work to reduce occupational lung disease in workers, associated with our health priority plan, and of course the new HSE 10-year strategy protecting people and places. So, an overview of the inspection programme of schools. We're inspecting a sample of 400 primary and secondary schools across GB. The number 400 has been selected as it's been deemed by our statisticians to be a representative number to give any data that comes out of that statistical credibility. Those schools have been selected on the basis that they actually do have asbestos-containing materials in them, and also to achieve a reasonable geographical spread across GB. So that's England, Wales and Scotland. These are single issue inspections, just focused on the management of asbestos. So sometimes when we go out and inspect, inspectors will look at a number of issues. So for example, woodworking, which is happening as well at the minute. They'll be looking at wood dust exposure, noise exposure, but also machinery hazards as well associated with the machines. Clearly, any inspection that an inspector attends or any site, if they see something which we refer to as a matter of evident concern or a matter of potential evidence concern, so someone working at height on an unprotected roof, for example, before they do anything, they'll focus on that and deal with that concern to start with. And these visits will be made by appointment between September and March next year. So normally we will do unannounced visits, primarily because we can see what actually is happening and there's no sort of, everyone tidies up or does what they should be doing, puts their PPE on. It's important that HSE does see the actual work activity and we don't have, we don't see something that's artificial. But clearly these visits need to be made by appointment because we need to see certain individuals, and schools are very busy places, and they can't just stop and down tools just for the purpose of an HSE inspection. So what's different about HSE's approach to this inspection programme? So I would say that when we do any proactive inspections, whilst people might think it's just about delivering the numbers, so just about delivering 400 inspections, to tick that off, we really do need to think about how these inspections are going to be effective and actually have an impact, because that's ultimately investing quite a lot of time and effort into these inspections. They need to have impact. We need to make change. So that's very much been I suppose the heart or the driving force for any of the in particular this particular updated briefing that we've done. So I'm going to talk about how we've updated it. When an inspector visits a school, they do have an opportunity to influence and educate those people that they speak to. So obviously they are there to test compliance, but in the course of that, they'll have a conversation, they'll have a discussion. They can illustrate, what the problems are and how to fix them potentially. So providing inspectors with the tools they need to understand the key issues which they might encounter is key to this. And that's why I've delivered this I deliver the part of the technical briefing, and I've updated it to reflect some of the things which we found from the last inspections, but also some of the things I find liaising with external stakeholders such as yourselves. The other thing that's different is we're using a digital recording form. I'll talk a little bit more about that, but that's really aids the consistency, or aids specific data to be captured, and also consistency of recording that. And finally, this is more to do with how we are sort of briefing the inspectors and how we're supporting them. But the COVID pandemic very much, certainly in HSE, accelerated the adoption of online working and the use of Office 365 applications. So Microsoft SharePoint app, we very much use these within HSE now. They almost act as like internal intranet sites, and having a dedicated site dedicated to the Asbestos in Schools inspection programs is very helpful. And again, I'll talk through that later. So moving on to how we have sort of briefed inspectors to slightly differently perhaps this year than previously. And one way we've done this is to sort of, what I put here, visualization of asbestos management as a process flow, and highlighting the key documents and continuous actions. So this is all really about sort of trying to show what duty to manage actually looks like. And I use the analogy of, if you've got a new recipe that you want to try out, you've got a cookbook. Personally, if I can't see the picture of the final dish, I won't do it, because I need to be able to see what it looks like to get there. And it's a little bit like this. This is a little bit like what we're coming from. So to help do this, we worked with the Asbestos Network management group to produce this flow chart, which basically is designed to sort of show what duty to manage is and capture it all on one page, and illustrate sort of specific documents, decisions, actions, and review pathways. So that's what it's designed to do, just literally a single page of A4, and that's given out to inspectors so they can see that. But it's also actually now available for anyone that wants to see it. It's on that website. It's been published by the Construction Leadership Council. And if you want to find a copy yourself, just enter CLC asbestos risk into an internet search engine and you can find it there. So this is just a little bit of a close-up, because I appreciate you couldn't see that, of the flow diagram at the bottom. So you can see clearly the documents, how they flow into each other, the actions in red, and the review pathways. Now I understand that CLC are looking to sort of use this to develop an app for workers, which is good, and also IOSH are potentially looking at using this to produce a bit more of an interactive web tool. So hopefully it will facilitate some visualization, I guess, of asbestos management, which is something different, something new. We do signpost here actually to specific parts of existing HSE guidance, which again can be helpful rather than relying on having to, rifle through pages and pages of guidance. There's some really key important bits which are worth signposting to people. So the quote at the top of this slide is taken from HSG 264 Asbestos, the Survey Guide. And it says, the information in the survey report should be used to form the asbestos register, which is a key component of the management plan. So clearly that sentence illustrates that there are 3 separate documents, if you like. And in reality, those of you that are aware of duty to manage will know that that is not necessarily the case. However, I do think it's important when we're talking about all 3 to make the distinction, because I think by making that distinction, that makes it easier to understand what the function of each of those documents are. And also, particularly with respect to the asbestos register and the asbestos management plan, that it's those 2 which are always in use and always under review. So those are like the working heart of asbestos management. That's not to say the survey report isn't important. Of course it's not. It's vital. An accurate survey is key to identifying asbestos. And anything, if the information that goes into the asbestos register isn't accurate, then that already puts the value of that document at risk. So the asbestos survey report, we're not ignoring those, but we're really focusing more on those day-to-day management documents when we're having those discussions with duty holders. So this sort of moves on to what I was sort of saying, focus, a shift in focus really on understanding the function of the documents and why they are needed. So to sort of illustrate that, I'm going to just sort of work through an asbestos register example. So firstly, this is the what. So what does the asbestos register contain? So it must contain the location of asbestos. That's where the information from the asbestos surveys is collated, their condition at the last inspection, an assessment of the exposure risk, accounting obviously for the type of the type of material is, its condition, and it's like the likelihood of disturbance from maintenance or occupant activity. And most importantly, the actions required to manage this risk. Now, as we know, buildings and the activity that takes place in them, it's always in a state of flux. There's people moving around, there's changes happening to rooms, perhaps due to COVID, for example. And that's why the register also has to, take on board that change of flux as well. And that's why we refer to it as a live register, an active document, if you like. But that's the what. If we ask a separate question, what is the function of asbestos register? We're actually asking, what is it actually meant to do? What is an asbestos register actually meant to do? So it's meant to provide clear information on where the asbestos is located for those people who occupy and work in the buildings. And that's because so that they can take measures to avoid disturbing that asbestos, or if they need to disturb it as a result of their work, that work can be undertaken with appropriate controls in place. Okay. So what else is it meant to do? It's also meant to provide clear information on areas that haven't been inspected, and therefore where asbestos may be presumed present until otherwise confirmed. That is vitally important, if not as important as locating where the asbestos actually is. The other thing the asbestos register is meant to do is facilitate the periodic inspection and condition assessment of identified ACMs to monitor for any damage or deterioration. And the register is where you record those findings. As part of that, it will provide information on the condition of each asbestos material and also the likelihood that the asbestos will be disturbed given its location. Those two factors combine to determine the risk from the asbestos, and that will change over time. Also, finally, and most importantly, detail any actions required as a result of the initial inspection, ongoing periodic inspections, or any other reason. Must detail those actions. That's what the asbestos register is meant to do. So I mentioned earlier that during an inspection, inspectors will be having conversations with the duty holder. And they may well, when they look at their asbestos registers, if they find it not to be functional, or to be lacking in any way, they'll be able to provide advice about how to make it functional from that context. So these are some of the things which they've been suggested to them to ask. So check that it includes all buildings that could have asbestos in them. By the very nature of schools, a bit like hospitals, they're comprised of various different buildings of various different ages, and it's easy actually to perhaps miss a building off, particularly if you've got a site that's very large, or even small buildings, small sheds, or garages, for example. So check that it contains all buildings built before 2000. Check the asbestos register actually includes information from all surveys and the latest re-inspection. Check that it includes areas that have not been surveyed and a warning that those must be presumed to contain asbestos. And in order to identify those areas, the survey report will be looked at, and particularly the caveats and exclusions section, because information where there's a caveat, that needs to be transferred into the asbestos register to highlight that those areas haven't been inspected for whatever reason. Incidentally, if inspectors do come across survey reports with unreasonable caveats and exclusions, they have been advised to consider taking action against the service provider, the surveyor of that report. The asbestos register has got to be clear and user focused. So whilst the inspectors on site, they need to sort of look at it and understand it themselves, but also check that the understanding of the duty holder, the people that need to use it or understand the school, how it's set up. So some of the things which they might be looking for is to check that it's organised into specific buildings, floors and rooms, and that those floors and rooms and buildings actually tally up with the numbers or the locations on site. And as part of these inspections, it's not just a desk-based review. Inspectors will be looking for particularly any high-risk ACMs, and then or any actions that have put in the asbestos register, and then they'll go for a walk onto the school grounds, onto the school buildings, and verify that the information that they've seen in the asbestos register or the management plan actually is true, or has been implemented, has been completed. So going back to looking at the asbestos register, does it include clear photos and plans of the asbestos, and do these, can they actually use them to allow them to be easily located? And they'll do that by actually doing it for themselves when they're doing the inspections. Does it include a clear description of the ACM product type, its condition? And finally, they'll be asking, how does everyone access this? Is it shoved in a drawer that's locked by the secretary? Or is it password protected and only certain people know? Again, it's got to be accessible to everyone who needs it, and that will definitely be checked. So, summary: asbestos register, to be functional, it's got to be clear, current, and accessible. I thought I'd also just cover what an asbestos management plan is meant to do. I think asbestos management plans, as I said before, when you have things in regulation or ACOP that tells you the what, asbestos management plan must include this, 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 and this. Okay, that's part of compliance, but if you don't use or do what the asbestos management says or keep it updated, then you're not fully compliant. So the conversation about what an asbestos management plan is meant to do will help convey that understanding. So an asbestos management plan, it must facilitate the understanding and cascade of information on how the risk from asbestos in the buildings is to be managed. It's got to identify those people with specific responsibilities, but also contingency arrangements. So, for example, when schools break for summer holidays, 6 weeks, the teachers and a lot of the admin staff will also go on their holidays. So if any of those have got responsibilities relating to asbestos management at a time where you're going to have a lot of the construction work or refurb maintenance work happening, that's clearly going to be something, a key part of the management process missing. So what are the contingency arrangements? The management plan must also set out how asbestos will be managed on a day-to-day basis. So we call this operational planning. What happens if things don't go to plan? So say there isn't an inadvertent disturbance, contingency planning, and what may need to happen in the future. So strategic planning, thinking about any refurbishment work. Asbestos should be considered early on in that process. And finally, the asbestos management plan provides a framework for audit and review of asbestos management arrangements. So asbestos management plan must be site-specific, current, and accessible as well. Re-inspections. Now, during the last inspection campaign, one of the things that was found by inspectors was a lot of re-inspection reports. So they looked like survey reports, but they were called re-inspection reports. And these were found, they were actually undertaken by surveyors on behalf of the duty holder to fulfil the ongoing requirement to monitor conditions. So the school can do them themselves and other duty holders can do them themselves, but surveyors can come in and offer this as a service. And indeed, UCAS identifies this as an accredited service. Whilst HSE guidance doesn't specifically reference this in that context, and we certainly, by saying this, I'm certainly not saying that it's a bad thing, but it's something which perhaps we weren't aware of was a particular issue. And the reason for this is that on one inspection, the inspector entered the office and there was a pile of 10 re-inspection reports dating back from the last 10 years, so one a year. Now clearly this adds to an already document heavy, information heavy management process. So the answer is quite simple. It just needs to be, you just need effective document management. But to understand, inspectors needed to understand why they were seeing these and what the purpose of these re-inspection reports were. And basically highlighting that the last re-inspection report needs to be the one that updates the asbestos register, and the asbestos register itself kept as that master document. All the other ones can be archived or disposed of. That's the information from them has been transferred into the asbestos register. So inspectors have been told to check that the asbestos register has been updated using the results of the last re-inspection. And also, again, go back to these actions, check that any actions have been completed. So actions which were recommended at the re-inspection, at the time of the re-inspection, have they been discharged? And finally, examples of what good looks like. Unfortunately, often I get to see bad things, but there is some good stuff out there as well. And we do like to give inspectors the positive spin, because again, in communicating with duty holders, if they can show them what good looks like, give them examples, then clearly they'll take that on board and move forward on that. So using photos, I mentioned this earlier. The survey guide does mention the use of photographs, and I think personally that they can be used effectively for two purposes. So firstly, close-up photos for condition checks. That's that image captures the condition of that asbestos at that time of that check. So it verifies that the inspection was completed, and it verifies the condition of the asbestos at a point in time. Clearly, those photos have to be close up. You'll see this one that I've just used in an example. That's where the damage is there. You could argue that perhaps to be a bit more accurate, it could do with being a little bit more close up, but you get what I'm trying to illustrate here, hopefully. And then when we're trying to explain or cascade the information about where the asbestos is to those that may be undertaking work in an area, they really need to see where it is. So this goes back to my earlier point about visualization. So this photograph here, this was from a survey report, and unfortunately I've only ever seen one survey report that's done it in this particular manner, but they've clearly illustrated the extent of the AIB here using red outline there, but clearly that photograph there clearly shows where the AIB is, and that shows, I think, in accordance a lot sat alongside the asbestos register, which will tell you information about its condition, whether it's painted or not, anything like that. That photograph sat alongside the register entry, sat alongside the site plans, will allow whoever's looking at that information to cross-check those three bits of information and check that they all marry up. So rather than just relying on a register that's got no photos in it or just a site plan, looking at those three information sources will provide a picture of the asbestos, a clear picture of where it is, but also allow whoever's looking at it to verify and check what they're reading. And if there's something that there's any discrepancy, they can then follow that up and look into that further, rather than run the risk of being given inaccurate or wrong information. I mentioned plans earlier. Again, unfortunately, I see so many unclear plans in survey reports or part of asbestos management plans. The idea of the plan again is to convey where the asbestos is. HSE 264, this is a very simplistic plan. This plan here basically just shows what rooms contain asbestos and what rooms aren't accessed, but it's very clear. What we tend to see, and again, I'm talking to an informed audience here, but you'll see these AutoCAD plans with little dots on where the sample was taken. I mean, that's fine because it shows where the sample was taken, but it doesn't do anything for showing people that are working on the building where the asbestos is. They have to rifle through the survey report or rifle through the register. Having a clear asbestos plan that shows where the asbestos is, even if it is just in a room, is far more useful than a dot in a room. So again, I think it's important to perhaps, and I know this goes against what we're saying about information and thickness of documentation, but these days, as we've moved into the more digital storage of information, having a series of plans, and perhaps an overarching one that shows you what rooms contain asbestos, and then underneath of the actual room itself and where the asbestos is, that in conjunction with a clear photograph and the entry in the asbestos register clearly shows where the asbestos is and conveys that information to those that need it. These are examples of asbestos register amendment forms or record revision sheets. These were from local authorities in England. And again, these are part of an asbestos management plan and clearly show that the school or the local authority has very much put in place a mechanism for revising the asbestos register. So again, inspectors, if they see these, that will tick the what. How you do it, what you do it, what's in place. But again, they'll be looking for evidence that these forms are actually used in vain. They're not just shoved in the management plan as an annex to show willing. So finally, just a few minutes talking about the digital recording form. Again, this is different this year because we previously have never used a digital recording form. The reason for using this is to facilitate the analysis of the information that's captured, and it'll enable more accurate recording of the findings. The form itself is broken up into various sections. It includes general information about the type of the school, primary, secondary level of education, whether it's local authority funded, whether it's got system buildings present. So there's information that will be captured as part of the general information. And then it'll look at 4 areas of compliance. So identification and assessment of asbestos and exposure risks. So that looks at the asbestos register, asbestos management arrangements, that looks at the management plan, and also work that's done by contractors or by in-house staff at the school. So a series of questions that cover that. And also, we've split it up into external contractors and in-house staff. External contractor work by external contractors should be properly planned, and asbestos should be, in the planning, looked at in the planning stage. So you shouldn't have external contractors arriving on site, and needing to rely on seeing the asbestos register. That really should take place early on in the planning process. And the questions try and tease out those arrangements and procedures that are in place. I mentioned about the SharePoint site. So this is an internal HSE resource. I'll just go through it. So we've got the inspection recording form, which I was just talking about. If you click on there, that will take the inspectors to the form and they can complete it and also submit it. This is the FOD briefing, which I've also been talking about today. So I provided the technical content for that briefing. There's some other stuff given by sector colleagues about the setup of schools, and also enforcement action. That was recorded, that event was recorded, so then it becomes a resource which inspectors can look at again, or those that were unable to attend the event would be able to look at it. So again, it ensures the inspectors are better informed. As part of that event, they submitted questions, and we either answered them live on the day, but what we did was actually capture those questions and answers, and there's a sort of a Q&A document that acts as a resource in this SharePoint site, which again they can access, and if they can't find the answer to their question, they can then click on this link here, or this box here, and that will take them to a dedicated email address, which will then be picked up by the education sector. And any questions, so I might get questions that might come across to me from that. And then again, we can answer those and add those to the Q&A document and attach that here. So this basically allows inspectors a single point of resource, I guess, to go to for the inspections, and also provide updated information, and anything else that we might think might be helpful, we can just add as guidance. And then finally, there's just some links here to specific HSE guidance regarding schools and education and asbestos, but also some new guidance that's been produced by the Department of Education on managing asbestos in schools, and also some new guidance produced by the Welsh Government on asbestos management in schools. Okay, finally, analysis of inspection findings. As I said earlier, HSE has to be efficient and effective when delivering proactive inspection programs such as this. It's not simply about numbers of inspections, so those 400 inspections that I've spoken of. Material breach rates, or numbers of improvement notice, are a metric that show the extent of a problem in a sector. But if we're finding that there's no change in this, despite revisiting the sector year on year, for example, we need to do something about it. We need to make sure that our inspections are actually having an impact, making that change. And a key part of this is really understanding more about the reasons for non-compliance and where it's happening. So the digital recording form will provide some quantitative data on compliance beyond the numbers. What lies behind, I guess, that's what I've called it. And the data can be sort of sliced up or analysed to look for compliance and non-compliance trends. So we can look at primary schools, we can look at how they're funded, we can look at the size of the school, and where the non-compliance is happening. And once we've got that picture, there might not be trends. There might be something that's systemic across all schools. But once we have got that picture, that will enable more specific and targeted either guidance or communications with relevant stakeholders. And it'll also actually inform HSE's, any future HSE's intervention programs in this sector. Brilliant. Right, that's all from me. Just like to say thank you. Any questions, any comments, any ideas, please just email me. But yeah, thank you very much for listening.